luck.
All right. Newly released records from special counsel Jack Smith's investigation into Donald Trump suggest prosecutors believed they had identified a possible reason for why the president kept troves of classified documents at his Mar-a-Lago club after leaving office. In a progress memo reviewed by MS Now, investigators write, quote, Trump possessed classified documents pertinent to his business interests, establishing a motive for retaining them, adding we must have those documents.
Hello and welcome, people. Adam is here. So what just happened, guys? A single document just leaked from the DOJ, and the man who wrote it is the one Trump spent years trying to destroy. One piece of paper, and the entire landscape shifts. Jack Smith, the special prosecutor who haunted Trump's nightmares through 2 separate criminal investigations, apparently decided before he resigned that he wasn't going to let the truth die in some sealed filing cabinet somewhere. He wrote a memo, not a brief summary, not a cursory overview designed to satisfy some bureaucratic requirement. He wrote a comprehensive, meticulously detailed, evidence-packed document that lays out exactly how Donald Trump knowingly and deliberately obstructed federal investigators who were trying to recover classified national security materials from Mar-a-Lago.
Well, you know, one of the biggest mysteries, Mika, for most of us serious fact-based journalists was like, what is the reason Donald Trump engaged in something that was so incredibly risky and put him at huge criminal exposure, taking hundreds and hundreds of pages of classified documents, some of them so top secret, so restricted that only the president could authorize people to review them. Why did he take these things from the White House in January 2021 as he left office and Biden assumed control of the presidency? And now we know from this January 2023 memo that appears to have been accidentally released by the Department of Justice under Donald Trump. Now we know this memo shows Jack Smith's team was working with the FBI, reviewing this as a possible motive and finding that he, Donald Trump, kept all these documents that pertained to his global business interests.
And now that memo is out in the world, spreading through newsrooms and legal circles and congressional offices like wildfire, and nobody can look away. Let me tell you why this moment is different from every other leak and scandal we've experienced. This isn't anonymous sources whispering to reporters. This isn't speculation about what might have happened behind closed doors. This is the lead prosecutor himself, the man who reviewed every piece of evidence, who interviewed every witness, who saw the full picture that nobody else was allowed to see, sitting down and writing out exactly what he found. And what he found, according to the excerpts that have now been confirmed by multiple media outlets, is devastating beyond anything we've seen before. Jack Smith gave an interview recently where he said something that should stop every American in their tracks. He said, "We had tons of evidence of willfulness. Tons of evidence."
After nearly 30 years of public service, including in international settings, I have seen how the rule of law can erode. My fear is that we have seen the rule of law function in our country for so long that many of us have come to take it for granted. The rule of law is not self-executing. It depends on our collective commitment to apply it. It requires dedicated service on behalf of others, especially when that service is difficult and comes with costs. Our willingness to pay those costs is what tests and defines our commitment to the rule of law and to this wonderful country.
Not a handful of ambiguous circumstances. Not a couple of documents that could be interpreted different ways. Tons of evidence proving that Trump knew exactly what he was doing was wrong and chose to do it anyway. That word, willfulness, is the legal term of art for the mental state that separates an innocent mistake from a deliberate crime. And Smith is saying they had overwhelming proof of it. Now, you might be wondering why any of this matters given Trump's current legal situation. He's the sitting president. The Department of Justice has a long-standing policy against prosecuting a sitting chief executive. Smith resigned when Trump took office because that policy left him with no path forward. The criminal cases are dead, at least for the duration of Trump's term. So what difference does a memo make? The answer is that it makes every difference in the world, because what we're witnessing right now isn't about putting anyone in handcuffs. It's about something that might matter even more in the long run. It's about whether the American people get to know what their president did. It's about whether evidence of potential crimes gets buried forever, just because the person who committed them is powerful enough to avoid prosecution. It's about whether Congress can still function as a check on executive power when the executive decides he doesn't want to be checked. And perhaps most importantly, it's about the historical record, the permanent account of what happened during these years that will be read by generations who come after us. The timing of this leak is absolutely extraordinary, and anyone who thinks it's coincidental hasn't been paying attention to how Washington works. Just days before this memo surfaced, House Judiciary Chairman Jim Jordan issued a subpoena demanding that Jack Smith appear before Congress to testify about alleged prosecutorial misconduct. Jordan has been building a case for months that Smith's entire investigation was a partisan witch hunt, that the Justice Department was weaponized against Trump, that the whole thing was political persecution dressed up in legal clothing. And then, right as Jordan was preparing to drag Smith into the spotlight and paint him as a corrupt operative, this memo drops. A document that doesn't just defend Smith's investigation, it vaporizes the attack before it even gets started. The contents of this memo are what make it so impossible to dismiss. According to the reporting, this isn't a vague narrative about Trump's general attitude toward the investigation. It includes actual communication logs, records of conversations, direct quotes from the former president himself. And the most damaging quote, the one that's already being carved into the historical record, is Trump allegedly telling his staff that federal investigators would never get those documents back unless I say so. Think about the implications of that sentence. The government comes asking for its own property, classified materials that belong to the American people, and the response from Trump is essentially that he's the one who decides whether the government gets its own secrets back. What makes this even more damning is the context in which those words were allegedly spoken. Trump's own attorneys, his advisors, the people he hired to protect him legally, were reportedly trying to comply with the federal subpoenas. They understood the seriousness of the situation. They recognized that defying a federal subpoena isn't a political disagreement, it's a potential crime. And according to the memo, they tried to do the right thing. They attempted to cooperate. They started the process of identifying and returning the materials the government was demanding, and Trump allegedly stepped in and stopped them. He overruled his own lawyers. He told them, in substance, if not in those exact words, that they worked for him and they would do what he said, and he was saying no. This is the detail that elevates the story from concerning to catastrophic. Because if Trump's staff had simply been negligent, if documents had been misplaced through carelessness, that would be one thing. If everyone had been on the same page about resisting, that would at least be consistent. But having the staff trying to comply and the principal personally blocking that compliance, that's the textbook definition of obstruction. That's what prosecutors look for when they're trying to prove criminal intent. And Jack Smith apparently has the receipts. The leak has created two completely incompatible realities in American political discourse, and the gap between them is so wide it feels like people are living in different dimensions. On one side, Democrats and legal analysts are saying this memo is the equivalent of a signed confession. They're pointing to the level of detail, the communication logs, the direct quotes, and saying that if this evidence had been presented to a jury, conviction would have been a near certainty. One former Department of Justice attorney described the memo as proof of obstruction in plain English, emphasizing that you don't need a law degree to understand what it says. The obstruction is right there on the page, laid out in clear, unambiguous language. On the other side, Republicans are crying foul in the loudest possible terms. They're not engaging with the substance of the memo because the substance is almost impossible to defend. Instead, they're attacking the process. They're calling the leak politically motivated. They're demanding investigations into who had access to the document and why they chose this moment to release it. They're saying this is exactly what they've been warning about, a deep state operation designed to undermine a sitting president through selective leaking of internal documents. Jim Jordan is already signaling that the leak itself will become part of his investigation, that he wants to know whether Smith or his associates orchestrated this release to influence public opinion. The thing about the Republican response that makes it so fascinating is what they're not saying. They're not saying the memo is fake. They're not saying the quotes are fabricated. They're not offering alternative explanations for the communication logs. They're talking about the leak because talking about the contents would require them to defend the indefensible. And they know it. The question of who leaked this document and why is genuinely important, even if it's also being used as a distraction from the substance. There are several plausible theories, and each one has different implications for what happens next. The first theory is that Smith himself, or someone on his former team, released the memo as a preemptive strike against Jordan's investigation. Jordan was coming for Smith, planning to drag him through hearings designed to destroy his credibility, and this memo is the counterpunch. It says, "You want to investigate me? Fine. Here's what I actually found. Here's the evidence you've been ignoring. Let's have that conversation in public and see who comes out looking worse." The second theory is that this was a protective measure, what lawyers sometimes call a CYA document. Cover your assets. Smith knew he would have to resign when Trump took office. He knew the case would be dropped. And he knew that once the DOJ was under Trump's control, the evidence his team had gathered might conveniently disappear. So he wrote this comprehensive summary to preserve the record, to make sure that even if the prosecution died, the truth would survive. The leak, under this theory, is just the natural consequence of creating a document that powerful people wanted suppressed. Sooner or later, someone was going to make it public. The third theory, and this is the one that probably keeps Trump up at night, is that there are more documents where this came from, that Smith's memo is just the tip of an iceberg, and that additional evidence, witness transcripts, recorded conversations, documentary proof, could surface in the weeks and months ahead. If this theory is right, the current firestorm is just the preview of a much larger conflagration. The congressional dimension of this story is going to dominate the next several months. Jim Jordan has made it his mission to prove that the Justice Department was corrupted by anti-Trump bias, and he's not going to abandon that mission just because an inconvenient memo appeared. He's going to demand that Smith testify. He's going to ask about every investigative decision, every witness interview, every piece of evidence that was gathered, and every piece that wasn't. He's going to try to build a record suggesting that the investigation was tainted from the start. But Democrats on the committee have their own agenda, and Smith's memo just handed them a gift of almost incalculable value. They're going to want to put Smith in front of the cameras too, but for very different reasons. They're going to ask him to walk through the evidence in detail. They're going to ask him to read those communication logs into the official record. They're going to use his testimony to paint a picture of a president who believed he was above the law and acted on that belief. And the American people are going to be watching. This is going to create a dynamic that Jim Jordan probably didn't anticipate when he issued his subpoena. He wanted a hearing where he could play the role of prosecutor, exposing the alleged misconduct of an out-of-control special counsel. Instead, he might end up presiding over a hearing where Jack Smith, under oath, with the entire nation watching, lays out the evidence of Trump's obstruction in excruciating detail. Every quote from the memo will be read aloud. Every communication log will be discussed. Every witness account will be referenced. And Jordan will be stuck in the chair, unable to stop it, watching his investigation transform into a platform for the very allegations he was trying to discredit. The irony is almost too perfect. In trying to destroy Jack Smith, Jim Jordan may have given him the biggest stage he's ever had. Let's talk for a moment about the specific legal concept at the heart of this memo because it's crucial to understanding why the document is so damaging. The word Smith used in his interview was willfulness. In criminal law, willfulness is everything. It's what separates a mistake from a crime, negligence from intent, the kind of thing that gets you a warning letter from the kind of thing that gets you indicted. If you accidentally take home classified documents and then cooperate with efforts to retrieve them, you're probably fine. It happens more often than people realize, even at high levels of government. The key is what you do when the government comes asking for its property back. If you return the documents promptly and cooperate with the investigation, the matter typically ends there. But if you refuse to return them, if you hide them, if you instruct your staff not to cooperate, if you overrule your own lawyers when they try to comply with subpoenas, you've crossed the line from carelessness into willfulness. You've demonstrated that you knew what you were doing was wrong and you chose to do it anyway. And according to Jack Smith, there is tons of evidence that this is exactly what Donald Trump did. The memo apparently doesn't just assert this conclusion, it provides the underlying proof. Communication logs that show the sequence of events, quotes that reveal Trump's state of mind, a paper trail that connects his words to his actions. This is the kind of evidence that prosecutors dream about because it doesn't rely on inference or circumstantial reasoning. It puts the defendant's own words at the center of the case. And when the defendant is the President of the United States saying he won't return classified documents unless he personally approves, those words carry a weight that no amount of spin can erase. The fact that criminal prosecution is off the table changes the stakes in an interesting way. If this were a normal case against a normal defendant, the memo would lead directly to a courtroom. There would be motions and hearings and eventually a trial where a jury would evaluate the evidence. But because the defendant is a sitting president, that path is closed, so the fight moves to different arenas: Congress, the media, the court of public opinion, and ultimately, history itself. This shift from legal accountability to political and historical accountability is disorienting for a lot of people. There's a natural desire for clear resolution, for some authority figure to stand up and say definitively what happened and what the consequences will be. But that's not how this is going to work. Instead, the American people are going to be presented with evidence and arguments, and they're going to have to make their own judgments. Their elected representatives are going to have to decide whether to pursue investigations. Historians are going to have to sift through the record and render verdicts that won't be final for decades. It's messy and unsatisfying, but it's the system we have. What's happening right now with this memo is a stress test for that system. Can evidence still matter when criminal prosecution is impossible? Can the truth still carry weight when the person it implicates is powerful enough to avoid legal consequences? Can Congress still function as an oversight body when one party is firmly aligned with the president and the other party is firmly opposed? These are open questions, and the answers will tell us a lot about the health of American democracy. The media coverage of this story has been predictably polarized. Outlets that have been critical of Trump are treating the memo as the definitive proof they've been waiting for, the smoking gun that confirms everything they've been reporting for years. Outlets that are sympathetic to Trump are focusing on the leak itself, questioning the motives of whoever released it, and suggesting the timing is designed to distract from other issues or to influence upcoming political battles. Neither approach is entirely wrong, and neither is entirely complete. The truth is that the leak and the contents both matter. The contents of the memo are significant because they represent the most detailed account we have of what Jack Smith's investigation actually uncovered. If the reporting is accurate, and multiple independent outlets have confirmed the key details, the evidence of obstruction was overwhelming. Trump's own words and actions, documented in real time, show a president who believed he was entitled to defy federal subpoenas and who used his authority to prevent his staff from complying with the law. The leak matters because it raises questions about how this document came to be public and what other documents might follow. If internal DOJ memos can be leaked whenever someone disagrees with a prosecutorial decision, that creates serious problems for the integrity of the department. But if the alternative is that evidence of potential crimes gets buried forever because the subject of the investigation is now in charge of the department, that's also a serious problem. There's no clean resolution to this tension, which is why the debate is so heated. The human element of this story is easy to overlook amid all the legal and political analysis. Real people were involved in these events. The FBI agents and prosecutors who worked on the investigation believed they were pursuing legitimate law enforcement objectives. The staff members who tried to comply with subpoenas were doing what they understood the law to require. The career officials at the National Archives who triggered the initial referral were performing their routine duties without any expectation that it would lead to a national crisis. And all of them have now been caught up in a political firestorm that shows no signs of abating. The former president, now sitting president, allegedly told his people that federal investigators would never get those documents back unless he said so. That sentence, if it accurately reflects what was said, encapsulates a view of presidential power that is breathtaking in its scope. It suggests a belief that federal subpoenas are optional, that compliance is discretionary, that the president's personal preferences override legal obligations. And that belief, more than any specific document or charge, is what this entire conflict has always been about. Where does this go from here? The immediate future will be dominated by the congressional investigations. Jim Jordan will push forward with his inquiry, though the ground has shifted beneath his feet. The memo gives Democrats ammunition to argue that Jordan's investigation is a cover-up, an attempt to discredit legitimate law enforcement work because it produced evidence that was politically damaging. Every hearing will be a battle over narrative, with Republicans trying to focus on the leak and Democrats trying to focus on the contents. The courts may also get involved, though in what capacity is unclear. There could be legal fights over the subpoena, over Smith's obligation to testify, over the classified nature of some of the underlying materials. These fights will take time to resolve, and they will generate their own headlines and controversies. But the ultimate resolution probably won't come from any of these institutional processes. It will come from the American people in elections where they get to decide whether the conduct described in this memo is acceptable, whether the party that enabled it deserves to remain in power, whether accountability matters, or whether it's just a word politicians use. The historical dimension of this story is perhaps the most important and the most overlooked. 50 years from now, when someone writes the definitive history of this period, Jack Smith's memo will be a primary source. It will be cited in footnotes. It will be analyzed by scholars. It will be taught in classrooms. And students will ask the same questions we're asking now. Did the president obstruct justice? What was the evidence? Why wasn't he held accountable? The answers to those questions will depend in part on what happens next, on whether Congress acts, on whether additional evidence emerges, on whether the political system responds to the information that has been placed before it. The memo is out there now. It can't be unleaked. It can't be unread. It can't be forgotten. The words it contains, the quotes it records, the evidence it catalogs are now part of the permanent record of this presidency. And that, in the end, may be exactly what Jack Smith intended. He knew he couldn't prosecute a sitting president. He knew the case would be dismissed when Trump took office. But he could make sure the evidence survived. He could make sure the truth was preserved. He could write it all down and trust that eventually, somehow, it would find its way into the light. That trust has now been vindicated. The light is shining, and everyone is being forced to look at what it reveals.